What happened to Providence's once bustling Chinatown? It's a forgotten story of prejudice and perseverance, and it's a story that is in the Providence Business News. And joining us this morning is editor Mark Murphy. Thanks for coming in. It's interesting that when I mentioned to one of our producers in the newsroom this was our topic, and he said, I didn't know Providence had a Chinatown. And I guess that's part of the point of the story, is that a lot of people didn't know.
Yeah, and I think every major American city had a Chinatown in one form or another, but they all experienced the same issues, and a lot of it had to do with migration and with resistance to migration. Mm-hmm. So there was a point in time, so the first wave of Providence's Chinatown was about the 1880s until World War I,
right.
But there was legislation put in place to limit Chinese migration. I mean, there was a distrust of the Chinese. They liked gambling. There were issues with opium, which at one time was legal to prescribe.
Right.
And so I think there were attempts to try to tamp it down.
Yep. And then there was in Providence, there was a resurgence then later in the 50s, I guess?
Yeah, after World War II, when a bigger issue were the Japanese coming out of the war. But it's still, at that point, the community had spread itself out. And in fact, if you were to say, if there's a center right now of the Chinese American community, it might be Cranston as opposed to Providence.
Yeah, and you talk about the distrust or whatever. In part of your article, you're talking about some of the practices back then where Chinese businesses couldn't have their name on it, just the number, and a restaurant, they couldn't have a curtain up between the dining room and the kitchen because they wanted to see what was going on in the kitchen.
That's right. They weren't being, and they didn't trust. They didn't trust that patrons, might be seduced into a life of opium addiction or something like that. Now I have to say, we have a lot of this information from a project that was done by some Brown graduate students and Brown faculty, and they did in the spring. They did an exhibit around the city, and they're still actually, if you go around different parts of downtown, they still have some of these boards up in windows, and you can see some of these details. But it's quite interesting, the distrust. In a sense, the parallels to some parts of today, it's not unheard of. So it's really an interesting story, and the Chinese themselves actually got around some of these regulations about immigration by, and it's one of the reasons why, for instance, there are so many Chinese restaurants, is if you were the owner of a restaurant, you could go back and forth to China and come back. And what they would do is they would switch off. A group of them would start a restaurant.
Right.
One person would be an owner for a while, then become a manager, then become a worker, and that way they could travel back, see their families or find a family, and then eventually settle in the U.S. So it was really an interesting workaround.
Yeah, so in terms of what's left today, you said it's not really Providence, obviously, anymore. It's kind of shifted around or just kind of spread out, I guess.
Yeah, and there are about 3,000 to 4,000, I think, Chinese Americans who really sort of trace their roots. There is still the large National An Liang Merchants Association. There is still an office based in Cranston, and so it still exists. There is a certain amount of cohesion, but as with so many immigrant communities, as you know, in the United States, and the Chinese heard the same thing, is assimilate, learn the language, become part of the culture, and I think they've been very successful at that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating read and a great look into our history here. Yeah, all right, Mark Murphy, thank you so much. It's in the Providence Business News, PBN.com.